The culture has been extremely hostile and one-sided, put it mildly, when it comes to Israel for many years. The General Assembly institutionalized an infrastructure of anti-Israel condemnations, a ritualistic adoption every year of about 20 resolutions at the General Assembly against Israel, when most countries in the world have zero. Numerous UN agencies have been obsessed with singling out and scapegoating Israel. Various serious efforts were made by the IDF to indeed make sure that the area, Gaza, that they were fighting, Hamas, is nevertheless being fed and having various essential services. We recognize that we're dealing with something that is not logical, that may have profound roots in pathologies that we've seen before in history, and that there's a fear that this is taking root in very scary ways.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Hillel Neuer. Hillel, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. I've wanted to talk to you for some time. You'll be familiar to viewers and listeners as an international lawyer, a human rights advocate, a real human rights advocate, not like one of the fake ones that we see all the time. And of course, executive director of UN Watch, which I think is doing the Lord's work in terms of holding the UN to account, especially on the question of Israel and how it treats Israel. So I've got a few questions I want to ask you, but I guess I'll kick off by asking you what it's been like at the UN, working around the UN over the past 3 years in particular, since 7th of October. I know you've been doing this for a couple of decades now, but I guess it must have become more intense over the past 3 years. What has the culture and the atmosphere been like?
Yeah, that's fair to say. Look, the culture has been extremely hostile and one-sided, to put it mildly, when it comes to Israel for many years. One could point to Yasser Arafat being invited to the General Assembly in 1974 and showing up with a holster. And it was around that time that the General Assembly institutionalized an infrastructure of anti-Israel condemnations, a ritualistic adoption every year of about 20 resolutions at the General Assembly against Israel, when most countries in the world have zero. A handful have one: Iran, North Korea, Syria, and there would be 20. Now it's 15 on Israel. So you could say that for some 50 years, the numerous UN agencies have been obsessed with singling out and scapegoating Israel, demonizing Israel. So that was there for a long time, and you could point to an array of UN agencies. What changed after October 7th was became on steroids. It became on steroids. If I have a Google alert when the words UN and human rights are mentioned, UN and Israel are mentioned, and certainly the UN and Israel, it exploded after October 7th, and agencies that would once have some shame today have no shame. And to some degree, this was led from the top by Guterres. To another extent, he was echoing what his staff was wanting, his international staff. So it's a combination.
Yeah, on steroids. I think that's a very good way to put it. Even as a very external observer of what the UN is doing, that strikes me as very true. Before we get into the meat of some of the stuff the UN and its agencies have been doing the past 3 years, I wanted to ask you, when you speak to UN officials or people at the UN about the disproportionate focus on Israel and the disproportionate number of rulings against Israel and obsession with Israel, how do they justify it, or do they even try to justify it? Is there a situation at the UN where they truly believe Israel is a uniquely monstrous country and thus deserves all this attention? Or is there some recognition at some level that this is getting a bit out of control?
Today, if there is any recognition, it's less than there ever was, and it would depend with whom you speak. Of course, when one walks into the United Nations Assembly, whether it's in New York or in Geneva, where I'm based, it's the same. 193 countries sitting in the room, and then so obviously there's a spectrum there. You have some countries today that are friendly to Israel, like the United States and Argentina, and a handful of others, but not many more today at the UN. But there's a spectrum, and then of course you have the UN Secretariat, which is the equivalent of the civil service. The UK had a famous show a number of years ago called Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister. And of course, there was the elected official who was meant to make the decisions. But of course, Sir Humphrey, who was the top civil servant, it turns out he was running many things. So the UN has that has their share of Sir Humphreys, not necessarily Guterres, but people who are there for decades and who orchestrate things behind the scenes. So that plays an element as well. And in terms of what you might hear from them, I remember speaking with a diplomat from a large Spanish-speaking country in Europe, and that diplomat, I was asking, I said, well, there's extreme bias in the General Assembly, where there's one resolution on Iran, one on North Korea, one on Syria, and at the time 20 on Israel. Today might be 15 on Israel, and that is pathological and obsessive, and it demonizes Israel and by extension Jews. And she said, "Well, Israel is an occupier." I said, "Well, okay, if that's the measure, then, as you know, according to international law, at the time, Morocco is occupying Western Sahara, and Turkey's occupying Northern Cyprus, and Armenia is occupying Nagorno-Karabakh from Azerbaijan, and several other instances." And you could see she was getting upset. This was not a discussion that she really wanted to have. And she said, "Well, are you saying they're the same?" So, no, of course not. Of course they're not the same. But you said it's because of the occupation. So let's look at other things. And if you want to look at human rights abuses, and qualitatively or quantitatively, China has 1.5 billion people. It's one of the most egregious human rights records in the world. If you look at it in terms of quality of human rights abuses or the quantity, it ought to take up much of the time of the UN. And in fact, there's zero resolutions on China, putting aside the fact that they occupy Tibet. And in the 60s, before communist China took over the UN seat, there were actually some resolutions on China occupying Tibet, but that ended many decades ago. So at some point, the conversation kind of ended. You could see that she couldn't really defend it logically. There were some pretexts that they would have: international law and occupation. And the moment you try to dig a little deeper, the conversation kind of ends.
Yeah, I've witnessed that in some of my own work, that sometimes their failures of logic are good to see. It can fall apart under even quite mild questioning and interrogation. Um, I want to ask you about some of the big lies that the UN has played a role in fostering over the past almost 3 years. I mean, there's the really big one, genocide, which I want to come onto in a moment, because I think that's one of the crucial issues of our time. That blood libel. But let's start with the famine question, because this has dripped into media discussion, almost everyday discussion as well. I meet people quite regularly who will say there was a terrible famine in Gaza. It was man-made. It was made by Israel. The UN played a role in spreading that misinformation. Um, where does the discussion about the famine currently stand? Is there any recognition in these bodies that they jumped the gun, or are they still running with it? Where does that stand right now?
I haven't seen recently what the latest declarations are. But certainly, if you ask about if there's recognition on things that they said before, it's very rare for the UN to acknowledge that they were spreading lies. And in numerous cases, numerous times, they either said that there is famine right now, or many people are going to die in the next 24 hours, or as the infamous case where a former British diplomat, Tom Fletcher, who is the head of the UN humanitarian agency, infamously went on TV and said 14,000 children are going to die in the next 48 hours. That was a complete lie, meaning he had been quoting from he was referring to some report, but he had completely distorted what it had said. It had made reference to some risk to some children within a year, and he boiled it down to 14,000 children are going to die in 48 hours, and it was quoted all around the world. And he's a very suave diplomat. He's kind of sees himself as kind of a James Bond figure defending the UN, and so he's very médiatique, as we say in French. And so that went all around the world. And then, a few days later, said, "Oh, well, maybe not exactly. I might have not been precise," and that correction appears nowhere. So I would say generally the UN has not corrected itself. From time to time, there are some experts who will identify the fact that the UN effectively acknowledged that what they were saying was a lie. And of course, there was no famine. There were major problems in Gaza, but there was no famine. And in the cases where they were able, where newspapers, at various points, there were several newspapers that wanted to show emaciated children. And in the most famous cases, these were children who had some pre-existing horrible medical condition or some disease that they were born with. And of course, infamously, the New York Times had one of these iconic photos of a mom holding an emaciated child, presumably who is being starved by Israel's actions and policies. And it emerged that right next to the emaciated child was not shown in the photo, but in the original photo was the second child who was healthy. And it's because the child who was emaciated had some horrible medical condition. It wasn't because of famine. Of course, there were very difficult conditions in Gaza because of Hamas's war, but Israel allowed in thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of food and aid and trucks throughout. It has emerged recently that some UN agencies did acknowledge quietly that Hamas was stealing much of this aid. So there was no famine. The photos of gaunt, emaciated people, the famous ones, were shown to be distortions and people who had from other things. But it's somehow there was, as you said, this isn't about logic. There was some kind of a demand in the world for this narrative, and a number of actors, bad actors, were complicit in supplying that demand.
Give us a sense of the scale of the misinformation involved in this. As you've just said, I mean, no one denies that there are difficulties in Gaza. There's war zones are very unpleasant places, and lots of bad things happen. I think everyone knows that. And you've mentioned that hundreds of thousands of tons of food were brought in, but you know, some people are just unaware of the extent to which Israel brought food into Gaza and has been doing so over over the past year as well. It was really brought home to me when Greta Thunberg and the other kefir people were sailing to Gaza with a couple of boxes of food and medicine or whatever they had. In the time it took them to get to Gaza when they were having their holiday on the Mediterranean, Israel delivered millions of meals to people in Gaza. And it's just, I wrote about it at the time for the Telegraph, and I got responses from people saying that they just had no idea that this was happening, that meals were being delivered every single day. So give us a sense of just the level of misinformation that is involved when people can genuinely believe that Israel was forcibly starving the people of Gaza when the precise opposite was the case.
That's true. Actually, the flotilla is an extreme case because I saw in Switzerland, and I think I was in France at some point around this time, and you could see how, in some ways, it was a very clever agitprop and political theater. They deliberately brought citizens from multiple countries so that they could say that they could then reach out to dozens of European countries and other Western countries and say that their citizens have been kidnapped and they're there to deliver humanitarian aid. When, as you said, it's a handful of boxes. The whole thing was performative, but that so many major newspapers treated it like it was a serious aid effort, which it wasn't, like they, were being, kidnapped and abused, in their last attempt, I think Israel detained them and sent them back within 24, 48 hours and, had no intention of keeping them, at all, and there was, um so, but you could see that the headlines, and I was in Geneva at one point when there was a mass demonstration because of the flotilla people being intercepted, and the people convinced themselves that the demon Israel was now kidnapping humanitarians to deliver aid, and so it was this theater where so many major newspapers were complicit in a farce. And those who called it out in France, there's a radio personality named Sophia Aram who's a satirist, and she mocked the farce. And then there were many complaints about her, and she was just calling it out for what it is. The whole thing was a farce. Indeed, I've met with UN agencies that are dealing with humanitarian issues. I've met with the IDF senior officers who are dealing with humanitarian issues. Various serious efforts were made by the IDF to indeed make sure that the area Gaza that they were fighting, Hamas, is nevertheless being fed and having various essential services, which probably has no analog in history. Where when the Western countries were fighting the Nazis, they weren't at the same time at that moment as they were bombing Dresden or fighting major wars. They weren't also in a major operation to supply food and water and other things to that population. Israel was doing that, and whenever Israel would do something, it would be um, cast as something demonic. For example, when Israel tried to, the challenge, of course, was that Hamas did not wear uniforms and would attack from homes, hospitals, and schools. And those who claim there is a genocide, that Israel tried to kill civilians, the interesting question why Hamas uh, always chose to uh, not wear uniforms. If Israel was killing everybody, then it would make a difference. Of course, Israel was trying to go after the Hamas terrorists. And so one of the things that Israel tried to do was to identify a particular region and say, okay, civilians, I want you to move away. You're going to go to another area. Egypt, put up massive barrier, wouldn't let a single Palestinian enter. The king of Jordan said on behalf of Jordan and Egypt, not one Palestinian will be allowed to leave. And that's because we care about the Palestinian cause. In the name of the Palestinian cause, we will not take in a single Palestinian. So Gaza has a border with Egypt on the Sinai. Egypt wouldn't take in a single one, so Israel had no choice but to sort of rotate at various points to be so that they could target an area where Hamas was tell civilians to move, and that was to let them live and not be targeted. And then the UN agencies would constantly claim ethnic cleansing each time this happened, which was absurd.
For me, that was one of the most extraordinary acts of doublespeak and doublethink and just Orwellian misinformation, where even when Israel was trying to save civilian life, it was accused of committing a war crime. I mean, it was just lie upon lie at that stage in the conflict. Um, you touched on the images of emaciated children from Gaza, and as you say, they were people, they were kids who had pre-existing conditions. Um, the famine lie, of course, feeds into another issue that has been raised constantly over the past 3 years, including by UN agencies and UN officials, which is this idea that Israel specifically targets Palestinian children for execution, attack. We hear this all the time from the left in the UK. I'm sure you get it from the left elsewhere as well, which is this idea that Israel kills children, baby killers. I mean, that phrase is literally shouted in the faces of British Jews very regularly. Um, what have you made of that focus from the UN and in across civil society, I guess, this idea that Israel intentionally targets and kills kids in Gaza?
Yeah, well, obviously it's absurd. And Israel was trying to stop Hamas, who massacred some 1,200 people on October 7th, invaded the country, and had taken over Gaza and embedded themselves in terror tunnels underneath homes, hospitals, schools, and mosques. And Israel was aiming for Hamas. In some cases, the claims that Israel was targeting children would be instances of where you'd have a 17-year-old Hamas gunman, and many of these things emerge. There's a gentleman on the internet. He's actually a fellow with UN Watch now. His name is Salo Eisenberg, and he's done deep dives into many of the names that were put out initially during the war as, innocent children, innocent humanitarians, innocent journalists. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of cases emerging now where Hamas is finally eulogizing them as Hamas martyrs and publishing photos of them with Kalashnikovs, videos of them throwing bombs. And some of these people were UNESCO certified journalists. UNESCO, a number of cases, the director of UNESCO had issued statements saying, I condemn Israel for killing a journalist so and so. And it took a year or two or three, and Hamas is now, they waited, but now Hamas, for their own internal purposes, needs to glorify them and releases photos. There's one UNESCO journalist, when I say UNESCO journalist, UNESCO condemned Israel for killing a journalist. And there's a 5-minute video of him firing multiple weapons, throwing bombs, jumping into tunnels, and he was no journalist. He actually did do some media work for Hamas, part of their propaganda, and so that person became a journalist, and he was also clearly a fighter. And, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of cases of this, and NGOs were complicit, and UN agencies were complicit.
What about the crossover? You've touched on this already, but the crossover between this so-called criticism of Israel, which is really a kind of deranged obsession with Israel, and then the impact that we're seeing on Jews across the Western world. Europe has got it really bad at the moment. Anti-Semitism is skyrocketing here, and has done for the past 3 years. Because, when you hear terms like, the Jewish state is a child killing machine, you can't help but think of earlier blood libels. I mean, the blood libel itself was born in this country that I'm speaking to you from, in Norwich in England in the 1100s, the idea that Jews target children for sacrifice. I mean, there is clear crossover there, isn't it? There is a rehabilitation of kind of ancient prejudices. What impact do you think the UN and those kinds of bodies are having on the security of Jews around the world?
Well, they're throwing fuel on the fire. That's the reality, and I think you identified uh, a very powerful dynamic. It's a meme, if you wanna, call it, or that existed for now nearly 1,000 years. That Jews, beginning in the medieval times, as you said, beginning in England, but rapidly spreading in other parts of medieval Europe, that Jews had a ritual to kill Christian children and use their blood to bake matzahs, and you know, many societies in Europe believed that, and that became uh, a reason, a pretext, and a preparation to kill Jews, to persecute them, to exile them on the basis of this a blood libel. Actually, it's interesting. There's a Jewish intellectual in the end of the 19th century named Ahad Ha'am, and he wrote an essay called "Half a Consolation." It was in Hebrew, but the translation is roughly "Half a Consolation." And Dr. Einat Wilf has written about this, and he says that there was some consolation in the blood libel accusation because there are many accusations made against the Jews at the time in Europe, and there were Jews who would read this, and some of them could internalize the lie and say, "Well, maybe we are horrible in this way and that way." He said, "But the blood libel, any Jew who knows anything about Judaism would know that's a complete lie because eating blood is something that's taboo in Judaism. You know, kosher meat. One of the things that you do is you remove the blood, so it's something that's prohibited in Judaism. So his half consolation was at least Jews would know that false accusation is a terrible lie. Um, and but indeed, uh, that is the exact um, impression that I get when I hear people when you say they baby killers. Well, that was said for 1,000 years with a pause of some 50, 75 years after the Holocaust when it became shameful to be overtly anti-Semitic, and we see that um, that taboo is fast being removed. And if Jews were called, for anti-Semites would call a Jew baby killer or Christ killer, uh, now you have something similar. Hateful people will walk up to Jews around the world and shout at them. So it really is a revival of longstanding anti-Semitic stereotypes dressed up in modern fashion. And of course, anti-Semitism has always been a mutating virus. It seizes upon that which is deemed virtuous in society and casts Jews as the enemy of that. So when society was religious, Jews killed God. And when society used science, science was a virtue, so Jews were the inferior race. And when a society was communist, Jews were the fascist capitalists. And in capitalist societies, anti Semites accused Jews of being communists. And in our time, the virtue is human rights and anti racism. And so the Jewish state, is accused of being an enemy of human rights and racist.
That's very well put. I wanted to ask you about Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur. People will know who she is. I think she recently claimed that she doesn't know who you are, which I find very hard to believe. But she is quite popular in left wing circles. She is in the media very regularly. I would say that she's one of the key people for in terms of spreading misinformation about Israel. That's my view. What's your view of the role that she plays? And I wanted to get a sense from you also of how seriously she's taken at the UN? Because it can be hard for some of us outside of that institution to judge that. Is she taken seriously there? Is she a big player, or is she more just of a media personality?
Well, technically, her position is not necessarily significant, meaning she is one of some 59 mandate holders. The Human Rights Council can appoint a monitor, which is called a special rapporteur or an independent expert, or it could be a five-person working group on themes like torture, racism, and so forth, or on a country situation like Haiti, North Korea, or in this case, Palestine, the Palestinian territories. And, many of them don't make the news. Um, she began to make the news, because she goes after Israel, and people like the product that she's selling. She's, she's very, um, active in the media, and, she's tweeting nonstop, so there never really was someone with that position. The mandate on Palestine territories was created in 1993. It's a special mandate because the other ones, there's about a dozen that deal with regions. So, for example, the special rapporteur on human rights in Sudan would, report on violations by the regime, but then also violations by the rebels. In many cases, there are violations on multiple sides. The mandate that she was given that was created many decades ago in February 1993, even before the Oslo Accords, unchanged since then, is to investigate, quote, to investigate Israel's violations of the bases and principles of international law in the occupied Arab territories, in the occupied Palestinian territories. So it's only to look at Israel, and Israel's actions are deemed violations. So when Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Fatah, the Palestinian Authority commit horrible abuses against their own people or against Israelis, that is not part of her mandate. So that's the Human Rights Council going back 3 decades. And but so there were many special rapporteurs in Palestine who were horrible. One of the infamous ones was Richard Falk, who held the position from 2008 to 2014. He was a 9/11 conspiracy promoter. He was a supporter of Hamas. But she's different because she's the first one to be extremely active on social media, extremely active in the media, and th she wields a certain, power and influence that is disproportionate to other UN officials because a normal UN official, I mentioned Tom Fletcher, who was telling lies, but, there is some accountability in theory. Antonio Guterres is the top of the UN Secretariat, and every employee at some point answers to him. And so if a UN official does something horrible, in theory, there could be some accountability. With the UN special rapporteurs, it's different. A situation was created where there's someone bearing the name of a UN official. In theory, they only speak for themselves. They're quote independent. They don't speak on behalf of anyone, and yet there's always whenever the media wants to, they will say when a UN rapporteur says something, instead of saying a UN appointee said something, that person is independent, doesn't represent the UN, doesn't represent the council, it only represents herself. That's not what they say. They'll say, UN says. Um, and what's distinctive about the rapporteurs is that there's no accountability. There's no accountability. So in theory, they're answerable to the council, 47 nation human rights council, but they meet only a few times a year, and they almost never take any action against the rapporteurs. So it's this bizarre phenomenon where you have someone vested with enormous influence around the world who can say the UN said there's genocide, and she Francesca Albanese typically will share whatever some radical pro-Hamas activists sent her, and you can see her just sharing screenshots that she just got 5 minutes ago, and just say alarm. And so it's enormous influence. It gets quoted around the world, and she can make things up, which she does on many cases. She made up a year or two ago. She gave a press conference in Geneva, and she said something like, "There's hundreds of thousands of children in Gaza who are being killed, and there weren't even that many amount of children in Gaza." From the number she gave, I don't know if it was 300,000 children under five. Forget the exact statistic, but she's just making up statistics that don't make any sense, that are factually, objectively impossible, and there's no accountability. Our group, UN Watch, which monitors the UN, has written numerous times to the president of the Human Rights Council, who in theory has the power to speak out, to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, who could speak out, to Guterres, who could speak out, his predecessor. I mentioned the case of Richard Falk. When Richard Falk supported the 9/11 conspiracy theory, Ban Ki-moon, then Secretary General, did condemn Richard Falk. And that was quite significant. Guterres has chosen silence. And so when the United States sanctioned her for overtly supporting Hamas, let's keep in mind that on October 7th, Francesca Albanese was tweeting in defense of Hamas, saying there's a context here. They're responding to oppression. And then since that day, she's acted as a propaganda vehicle for every Hamas lie. And when the US urged Guterres to take action, to speak out, he did nothing. And eventually the US sanctioned her, which was the first time that she was held accountable. That was a good thing.
Yeah, someone had to do it. Um, Hillel, I've just got a couple of quick questions for you before I let you go. I wanted to ask you about UNRWA, the UN agency for so-called refugees in the Palestinian territories. Keir Starmer's government chose to rehabilitate funding for UNRWA, which was very controversial, not least because the British-Israeli hostage, Emily Damari, for a period of time was held, she said, in an UNRWA building, which essentially meant that our government was funding an institution that in some way was helping to hold British citizens hostage. I mean, it was extraordinary. Give us a sense of what UNRWA, the problematic role, to put it mildly, that UNRWA plays in terms of radicalizing, helping to radicalize people in Gaza, helping to sustain movements like Hamas. What kind of role does UNRWA play there?
Warner plays a very substantial role in, sadly, in perpetuating the conflict. It's not why it was created. It was created with altruistic purposes. The US was a major figure around 1949, 1950. There was the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, Israel's War of Independence. The Arab states that invaded Israel lost, and there was an exchange of populations. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews from Arab countries, more than 800,000 from Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, that were basically pushed out. Many of them came to Israel. Some found refuge elsewhere. And in that war, there were Palestinian Arabs who were displaced. Some of them left because they were told by their allies to leave while they crushed the Jews. Others were pushed out during the conflict. And they went miles away, meaning they went some cases 5 miles away. Like those in Gaza arrived from places that were maybe 5 miles, 10 miles, 30 miles away. They went from Arab Muslim areas to neighboring Arab Muslim areas. They could have been absorbed easily. And that was the point of UNRWA, was to help them start a new life. But very quickly, they decided that they refused to accept that they had lost the war, and they decided to perpetuate this very bizarre and cruel policy, which is to say, we will not be resettled. And the Arab states joined in with the Palestinian leadership at the time to say, we reject any form of resettlement. Our mission will be to dismantle Israel. The war is not over. And effectively, after about 5 years of UNRWA existing, once they realized that the Palestinians who were then living in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Gaza refused to resettle in a normal way, but kept holding on to the goal of dismantling Israel, UNRWA became a pathological agency. And so, 70 years later, after having received billions and billions of dollars from UK taxpayers, EU taxpayers, US taxpayers, they haven't resettled a single Palestinian. In that time, as I mentioned, more than 800,000 Arabs from Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, Syria, Libya were resettled in Israel. And Israel, one of its leading military officers, is now running for office, named Gadi Eisenkot, who may defeat Netanyahu. He's a Moroccan Jew. So the Jews who came from the Arab countries have gone on to lead very productive lives, and that's of course what the Palestinians could do. You have this anomaly where there are 2 million Arabs living in Jordan who are Jordanian citizens, who are of Palestinian descent. They came from apparently from what was British Mandatory Palestine in 1948-49, and they are Jordanian citizens. They've had citizenship for decades, and yet there's this oxymoron where they're called refugees, even though there's nowhere else in the world where if you are a Sudanese refugee and you get a British passport or a US passport and you're living in those countries, you're still called a refugee. It's one or the other. So, but the UN has UNRWA as an agency designed to dismantle Israel, to teach generations of Palestinians that their goal is not to move on with their lives, but to exist as dependents and to dream of dismantling Israel. And you asked about the role that UNRWA plays. I'll just mention two cases that are emblematic, one in Gaza, one in Lebanon. In Lebanon, there was the head of the teachers union of UNRWA named Fathi Sharif. He was a teacher for some 30 years, school principal of about 1,000 students outside of Tyre, Lebanon, for UNRWA. And he was also the commander of Hamas in Lebanon. So I'll say that again: UNRWA teacher, school principal, head of 2,000 teachers in the union of UNRWA, and he was the commander of Hamas. How do we know it? Hamas said so. Israel delivered justice to him. I believe it was September 2024, in a missile that took him out. And the day he was killed, Hamas released a video saying, "Woe unto us! Our commander, our Hamas commander, has been killed." The great Fathi Sharif, one can see the video on the internet. It's about a 3-minute video. He gave jihadi education. We eulogize him. They showed pictures of him with Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, and him walking around with bodyguards. And he was the head of 2,000 UNRWA teachers. You couldn't make this up if you wanted to. And the UN spokesman said, "Well, how could we know? Hamas is an underground group." And well, we released a report, I think it was called Teachers of Terror, and it was 100 pages of Fathi Sharif every day on Facebook, posting how much he loves Hamas, pictures of him at Hamas funerals, pictures of him handing prizes to 5-year-old kids learning martial arts with the Hamas headband. And these were publicly posted on his Facebook page, on the community website. How could you know? Well, he told you every day. And there's a copy paste, same case in Gaza. Suhail al-Hindi, head of the teachers union, 8,000 teachers in Gaza, school teacher, was on the Hamas Politburo, working closely with Yahya Sinwar. There's pictures of them together. He's now in exile in Turkey. Is one of the Hamas leaders. Suhail al-Hindi was the head of the UNRWA teachers union.
I mean, I've read your reports on this stuff, but it's every time I hear it, it's just extraordinary and shocking. Okay, Hillel, my last question for you is the big question, so I probably shouldn't have left it till last, but I wanted to ask you about where you think the genocide lie will go next, because it seems clear to me that this has become quite an entrenched myth in our societies. We hear it every single day from members of the political class, from the media. It's on the streets. You see graffiti that mentions the so-called genocide. It's a deeply entrenched myth. It's obviously not stacked up by anything resembling a fact, and if in fact, I think some people's eyes are being opened to what a level of misinformation was involved in this accusation. Um, but how dangerous has that claim in particular proven to be, do you think? And do you see any hope on the horizon that at some point it might be dismantled by the kind of logic that people like you bring to the discussion?
Well, I think nothing could be more substantial than the genocide accusation in terms of paving the way for a real genocide that could be perpetrated against Jews. The amount of hate that is being mobilized based on a complete lie, where you see people are so worked up, and they when they shout out "baby killer" at a Jew in a restaurant, they've been brought into this state. And it seems, history has shown that those kinds of lies were the precursor to terrible massacres, and that's we've seen that many times in the past, and there's every reason to fear that this could happen again. There were these mob violent situations in Amsterdam when they were hunting for Jews. There was, shortly after October 7th, a situation in a Muslim province, I think it was Dagestan, of Russia, where an Israeli plane was landing, or there was a belief that there were Israelis on the plane, and mobs of thousands ran onto the tarmac, with blood in their eyes. So I think the genocide lie is indeed driving the anti-Semitism. How to predict where this will go? If we look at history, and we know that these blood libels take on a ritualistic obsession, um, and become something that is completely pathological, and it's very scary. The ideas of the blood libel for 1,000 years in Europe were very strong, and took hold of people's brains. And no amount of logic could dispel it. So um, i- groups like ours are working to tell the truth. It's a complete lie, but we recognize that we're dealing with something that is not logical, that may have profound roots in pathologies that we've seen before in history, and that there's a fear that this is taking root in very scary ways.
Hillel, thank you very much.